To those of us of a certain age, Hammer represents the quintessential horror movie. The horror movies we remember growing up. At least we think we do. Hammer ceased production in 1976. Now, I'm personally 67. So in 1976, I was 19, which basically means that I was only old enough to watch X-certificate movies on the cinema for a year. So we actually saw most of those movies on the small screen later on. I know there will be some of you here older than me, but the vast majority of you watching this will have watched most of your Hammer movies on the small screen. In the period from the 50s to the 70s, they produced over 100 movies. Most of what we remember as the horror movies that we watched when we were younger. Why did they finish in 1976? What changed? Well, the main thing that changed is in 74 and 76, you had The Exorcist, The Omen, Carrie, much more shocking movies being released. And it brought the end to Hammer. But it doesn't bring the end to the Hammer story. Hammer set up most of the tropes that are still used today. Movies like Blade and Underworld still use the vampire tropes that were set up by Hammer in the 60s and 70s. So how did Hammer start? How did it get into the horror genre originally? And why was it so successful? If you've never watched a Hammer movie, I'm sure some younger viewers probably haven't. And if you do, they might seem tame to you. But they have a charm that comes with age. A charm all to themselves. And they deserve their place in movie and horror movie history. So let's take a look at Hammer. How it started, how it rose to its peak in the 60s, and why it declined. When Enrique Carreras and Will Hines, better known by his stage name Will Hammer, formed a distribution company, Exclusive Films, in 1935, they had no plans to become horror film producers. In 1947, joined by their sons James Carreras and Anthony Hines, they re-established their small independent company, Hammer Films. They never initially intended to focus on one genre, and certainly not on horror. In the immediate post-war period, it was inconceivable to consider focusing on horror films. The horrors of the war had been enough for censors and audiences alike, and there was little desire for fantasized violence on the screen. In 1951, Hammer moved to a large Gothic mansion in Bray in Berkshire, and the introduction of a new X certificate and the popularity of their sci-fi films like Quatermass Experiment, they soon turned to Gothic literature for material. And it was with one of their earliest of these, The Curse to Frankenstein in 1957. Sadly, the year that the man who gave his name to Hammer passed away. This began a chain reaction which saw Hammer blossom into a horror brand identity. An association which has run for over 20 years until the late 70s and spawned horror classics loved by us boomers. However, it's for a particular brand of horror films that Hammer is most remembered. It was the British touch that Hammer injected into classics such as Dracula, Frankenstein and The Mummy that helped these films become world famous. Even though it's not entirely correct to say that the critical reputation of the London-based Hammer Film Studio was always low, it is true that until the 70s, very few critics took them seriously. A typical reaction to The Curse of Frankenstein on its release in 1957 was that of Caroline Lejeune, the critic of The Observer, who described it as among the half a dozen most repulsive films I have encountered. The box office boomed, but the critics either smiled indulgently or got out the vomit bag. I'll give my opinion on this by quoting a famous countryman of mine, Brendan Bean. Critics are like eunuchs in a harem. They know how it's done, they see it done every day, but they're unable to do it themselves. Today, however, with even a cursory examination of the Hammer Film Studios, it soon becomes apparent that they represented something of a secret history of British cinema, running alongside the respectable face of Hitchcock, Ealing comedies and kitchen sink drama. All of which, by the way, we plan to cover on this channel, so don't forget to like, subscribe, and most importantly, tap the notification bell to know when they drop. Many Hammer films have since been praised for their atmosphere and striking visuals, and for establishing tropes that are still widely used today. Their influence on other filmmakers is incalculable, both in their home country and abroad. The American movie brats were massive fans. Hammer fans include Martin Scorsese, who has said, "In my early teens, I went with groups of friends to see certain films. If we saw the logo of Hammer, we knew it was going to be a very special picture. A surprising experience and shocking." The shock value of The Curse of Frankenstein, The Mummy and Dracula might be lost on the modern viewer, but when they splattered onto the cinema screens in the late 50s, they were radically new, employing a formula that re-energized the genre. And with Peter Cushing pitted endlessly against Christopher Lee, the movies became global blockbusters. But the thing about shock is that after a while it's not shocking anymore. In 1976, after a decade reduced to churning out ever cheaper thrills, Hammer shut up shop. However, the shutters came back up again in 2008 with the release of Beyond the Rave, a love story involving marauding vampires, an Iraq war backdrop, and a soundtrack by DJ Pete Tong. Given his name as Cockney rhyme and slang for wrong, it was apt. There was little about the movie that would appeal to those for whom the Hammer name resonated, and little to appeal to a new generation. Put simply, they haven't yet captured their glory days. You know what? I'll move the yet to the end of the sentence and let it hang there. The cult remains strong to this day, but there are more than 100 Golden Age Hammer films to go through. And for the casual viewer, there can be a feeling that if you've seen one, you've seen them all. For the purposes of getting to grips with the Hammer phenomenon, it's better to concentrate your viewing efforts on the studio's Golden Age, which ran from 1955 to 1976. Their most recent productions have plenty of merits of their own, though, and one of them, The Quiet Ones, numbered among the most underrated films of 2014. We list the best known chronologically rather than ranking them. I'm not sticking my head above that parapet on this one, but please let us know your favourite in the comments. We will take them year by year. In 1956, the Quatermass Experiment. There's no room for personal feelings in science. Professor Bernard Quatermass oversees 3-man space mission that goes awry. The ship crash lands in English countryside, so Quatermass and his assistant, Marsh, set out to find it. They discover that only one astronaut, Victor Carroon, is still alive. However, he appears to be morphing into an alien life form. The Quatermass Experiment was a big hit on release and significantly boosted Hammer's profile, bringing the production company to the attention of major distributors. It is also notable for predating the similar Invasion of the Body Snatchers by a full year. Despite somewhat lackluster creature effects, the monster resembling little more than a large slime-filled sack. The climatic scene set in Westminster Abbey is well done. It may be a little rough around the edges, but there is a certain charm and nostalgia to the film, with its distinctive accents, outdated futuristic gadgets, and visionary scientists. 1957, as we said, sadly saw the demise of the man who gave his name to the Hammer Studios. It also saw the birth, really, of the horror movie, the Hammer horror movie, with The Curse of Frankenstein, which was released on June the 25th, 1957. A day after I was born, actually. Let's let our friend here rest in peace, while he can. This adaptation of Mary Shelley's classic novel follows the morally dubious scientist Victor Frankenstein, played by Peter Cushing, as he embarks on a reckless quest to conquer death itself, with the aid of his assistant Paul Kremp. Frankenstein defies the laws of nature to reanimate dead tissue, stitching together a monstrous creature from various cadavers. Here Cushing turns in a career-defining performance, radiating obsession and menacing swagger. Lee is also impressive beneath his pounds of makeup. Taking on a character this iconic is no small feat, especially given Boris Karloff's towering portrayal, but he succeeded in making it his own. He's helped along by makeup artist Phil Leakey, who crafts distinctive look for the monster, which is a bit more subtle, while still being creepy. The Curse of Frankenstein was a massive hit, reportedly grossing more than 70 times its budget, paving the way for Hammer's subsequent projects. The Abominable Snowman was released on October 19th. This creature may have an affinity for man, something in common with ourselves. Let's remember that before we start shooting. This icy horror centres on Dr. John Rollison, played by Peter Cushing, and his colleagues Dr. Tom Friend. They're on an expedition to find the Yeti, the legendary monster of the Himalayas. As they venture deeper into the treacherous terrain, they encounter the enigmatic Lama, who warns them of the dangers that lie ahead. Although the plot is somewhat slight, The Abominable Snowman is oppressive and claustrophobic. Director Val Guest ratchets up the psychological tension, rather than solely relying on creature scares. The characters also wrestle with ethical dilemmas around the pursuit of the surprisingly intelligent creature. In part, this decision may reflect budget constraints, as they couldn't show the Yeti too extensively. Either way, it works. Finally, the desolate shots of the snowy landscape, with the characters appearing as lonely specks against him, hold it all together. In 1958, we have the quintessential Lord of Darkness, Dracula, released on June 16th. I am Dracula, and I welcome you to my house. There'd already been Dracula movies for decades when Hammer decided to try their hand at the character, but this version packed far more bite. Lee leads the cast as the Bloodsucker, joined by John Van Essen as unsuspecting librarian James Harker, and Peter Cushing as Van Helsing. Harker and Van Helsing must venture through a labyrinth of secret horrors and forbidden desires as they race to save Harker's beloved Lucy, played by Carol Marsh. Drenched in vibrant technical visuals and propelled by a thunderous score, Dracula injected fresh energy into the classic tale. The movie crackles with thinly veiled sensuality, most of it courtesy of the charismatic Lee. Like The Curse of Frankenstein, it was a major blockbuster, and its success left a lasting imprint on the vampire genre. Indeed, in the decades since, Dracula has appeared in more than 538 movies, making him the most played literary character of all time. In 1959, we are introduced to another character who would appear on the list of most played characters of all time, Sherlock Holmes, in The Hound of the Baskervilles, which was released on July the 3rd. There is more evil around us than I have ever encountered before. With this film, Hammer put their distinctive spin on the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle iconic detective. It sees Sherlock Holmes, played by Peter Cushing, and Dr. Watson, Andre Morel, heading to the English moors to investigate the mysterious death of Sir Charles Baskerville. Their inquiries lead them to the gloomy Baskerville Hall, where the enigmatic heir Sir Henry Baskerville, played by Christopher Lee, finds himself haunted by the legend of a demonic hound said to stalk the family. Despite significant deviations from the source material, the movie ultimately succeeds because of the terrific work done by Fisher and his crew, who imbue the film with their signature Gothic style. The acting is also solid. Cushing expertly balances Sherlock's charm and arrogance, and Morell deserves praise for moving beyond the bubbling stereotype of the typical Watson performances. His take on the character is almost on par with Holmes, and they have an entertaining chemistry. Lee is also great, but that goes without saying. The Man Who Could Cheat Death. A centenarian artist and scientist in 1890 Paris maintains his youth and health by periodically replacing a gland with that from a living person. On December 16th, 1959, we had The Mummy. He who robs the graves of Egypt dies. In 19th century Egypt, archaeologist John Manning, Peter Cushing, and his team uncovered the tomb of the ancient Egyptian priestess Ananke. However, in the process, they inadvertently awakened the vengeful mummy of Caris, Christopher Lee. Seeking to resurrect his long-lost love, the Revenant embarks on a rampage, leaving death and destruction in his wake. Caught in the crossfire is Isabel, a young woman who bears an uncanny resemblance to Ananke. While certainly campy, The Mummy is also visually impressive, boasting some of the best cinematography and lighting of any Hammer film from the era. Notable locations such as the Mummy's tomb and the swamp in the British moorlands stand out as highlights. The plot is quite predictable, especially in hindsight, but the movie deserves praise for its surprisingly thoughtful themes. It has much to say about the clash between ancient beliefs and modern ignorance, especially the latter's tendency to exploit anything deemed valuable. In 1960, we technically have another Dracula movie, although it's entitled The Brides of Dracula, released on September the 5th. The Count never appears. Count Dracula, monarch of all vampires, is dead, but his disciples live on. Count Dracula is notably absent from this movie, yet his malevolent legacy looms large over Transylvania. Their schoolteacher, Marianne, and vampire hunter Van Helsing must contend with the Count's acolytes, who seek to revive the blight of vampirism. Baroness Meinster keeps her vampire son chained up, bringing him victims to feed on, but his dark influence soon begins to seep out beyond the manor walls. The Brides of Dracula doesn't add much to the vampire mythology, and the antagonist doesn't hold a candle to Christopher Lee. But the movie compensates with exquisite costumes, meticulous production design, and a delectable Gothic atmosphere. Cobwebs, crypts, dark forests, and shadowy corridors are abundant here. Director Terence Fisher once again flexes his confidence with the kind of material, plus the sexual overtones add a different kind of tension. In 1961, we meet another classic monster in The Curse of the Werewolf. A man with brutal and macabre origins, Leon Coledo, was raised in the home of Don Alfredo Coledo, his kind and loving adoptive father. When he leaves Don Alfredo to find work, Leon discovers that he has increasingly violent urges. Although these tendencies are calmed by Leon's love for the beautiful Christina, he ultimately cannot contain his curse and transforms into a werewolf, terrorizing the Spanish countryside. Taste of Fear, released on August the 22nd. Easily one of Hammer Film's greatest achievements when it comes to dark and deeply disturbing original horror experience. Taste of Fear, also known as Scream of Fear in the US, is one of the studio's most critically acclaimed and widely beloved films. The film follows a young girl who uses a wheelchair and finds herself returning to her father's estate for the first time in 10 years. Despite being reassured that the father is away and gone from the estate, however, she keeps experiencing haunting visions of his dead body. Taste of Fear was deeply ahead of its time in terms of its approach to psychological horror, combining its dark themes and twisted concepts to come from what is within our own mind instead of a physical, tangible monster. The execution makes this film easily one of the best of its era, with pinpoint precision in creating masterful tension and painful dread, with each reveal and twist unfolding. While the film may not be iconic as some of the studio's more acclaimed monster films, it easily deserves a spot as one of the best Hammer horror films. Dracula, Prince of Darkness returns to the trope of travellers finding themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. Two couples travelling in Eastern Europe decided to visit Carlsbad, despite dire local warnings. Left outside the village by a coachman, terrified at the approach of night, they find themselves in the local castle and are surprised at the hospitality extended by the sinister Clove. It turns out the owner, Count Dracula, dead for 10 years, has been hoping for such a visit. 1963, we visit an early incarnation for a film that has been repeated many times, most notably as a musical, The Phantom of the Opera. The corrupt Lord Ambrose Darcy steals the life's work of the poor composer Professor Lepetri. In an attempt to stop the printing of the music with Darcy's name on it, Petrie breaks into the printing office and accidentally starts a fire, leaving him severely disfigured. Years later, Petrie returns to terrorise a London opera house that is about to perform one of his stolen operas. Kiss of the Vampire, released in September 1963. Gerald and Marion Harcourt are travelling by car when the car breaks down and they have to spend a few days in a small remote village. It doesn't take long until they're invited into Dr. Ravna's castle. Without their knowledge, Dr. Ravna is the leader of a vampire cult and has become astonished by Marianne's beauty. In 1964, we are introduced to a monster from classical mythology, the Gorgon, released on August 21st. In early 20th century Middle Europe, villagers are literally becoming petrified. Although the authorities try to hush the matter up, it is apparent that at the full moon, Megara, a Gorgon, leaves her castle lair, and anyone looking at her face is turned to stone. When this fate befalls a visitor, experts from the University of Leipzig arrive to try and get to the bottom of it all. In 1965, we have probably the best. Is it a psychological thriller? Is it a horror? Is it both? One of the best movies that Hammer produced, The Nanny, released on October 27th. In what is easily one of the best and most underrated performances from Hollywood icon Bette Davis, The Nanny sees Betty as a titular live-in maid tasked with caring for morbid 10-year-old who has been in a psychiatric ward for 2 years. The young boy is unwilling to eat the food that Nanny has prepared and demands to sleep in a room with a lock. With his parents all but convinced that he is disturbed and too far gone. However, the truth proves itself to be much more complicated, as the boy may be justified in his fear of the nanny. The Nanny succeeds greatly thanks to its slow, methodical pace and psychological horror approach to its concept, allowing the terror and nightmare premise to simmer as it boils to a point of dread and despair. Davis easily elevates the character of the Nanny to massive heights, finding the perfect balance between a seemingly wholesome caretaker and a vicious, mysterious dark side lying beneath the surface. It's highly unique among the other films in the Hammer film catalogue, but it helps distinguish it as truly something special in their lineup. In 1966, the year the World Cup came to England, Hammer reintroduced us to Dracula, Prince of Darkness, released on the 9th of January. After a reign of terror spanning more than a century, the King of the Undead was finally traced to his lair high in the Carpathian Mountains. The plot is straightforward. Four travellers seek shelter in Castle Dracula, unaware of the horrors that await them. Ignoring the warnings of the village, they unleash Dracula from his slumber, leading to a battle for survival as the Count tries to spread his malevolence once more. The story may not be especially memorable, but there are several solid set pieces. Dracula's resurrection scene chief among them. They work thanks to Lee, who pushes the character's ferocity to new heights. This was Lee's second film as Lord of Vampires. In this one, he hisses like a beast, all blood red eyes and menacing fangs, without uttering a single word. Reportedly, Lee kept silent in the movie because he didn't like the script. I said to Hammer, "If you think I'm going to say any of those lines, you're very much mistaken." The actor was reported as saying. Also on January the 9th, we're introduced to yet another classic monster from horror lore in The Plague of Zombies. Young workers are dying because of a mysterious epidemic in a little village in Cornwall. Dr. Thompson is helpless and asks Professor James Forbes for help, and the professor and his daughter, Sylvia, travel to Thompson. Soon terrible things happen beyond imagination or reality. Dead people are seen near an old unused mine. Recently deceased people seem to have come back to life. Professor Forbes presumes that black magic is involved and someone has extraordinary power. He doesn't know how close he is. The dead become alive because of a magic voodoo ritual, so they must serve their master as mindless zombies. On the 6th of March, that same year, two other movies were released. The first, again, is one of those that's debatable. Is it horror or is it simply a play on historical fact? Rasputin the Mad Monk. Thrown out of his monastery for licentious and drunken behaviour, Rasputin travels to St. Petersburg in pursuit of wealth and prestige. He soon gains influence at court with his powers of healing and hypnotism. And also on March the 6th, we have The Reptile. In a Cornish village, various locals die from mysterious snake bites, but the coroner rules the deaths as heart attacks until a family of newcomers start an investigation. Following the brutal murder of a young real estate agent, a hardened detective attempts to uncover the truth in a case where nothing is as it seems, and in doing so, dismantles the illusions of his own life. 1967 sees the release of another mummy movie and another Quatermass movie. In The Mummy's Shroud, in 1920, an archaeological expedition discovers the tomb of an ancient Egyptian child prince. Returning home with the discovery, the expedition members soon find themselves being killed off by a mummy, which can only be revived by reading the words of the prince's burial shroud. And Quatermass and the Pit. The third film of the Quatermass trilogy, Quatermass and the Pit, sees Professor Bernard Quatermass having to deal with the consequences and outcry of some mysterious ancient human remains discovered near the London Underground. As more and more mysterious occurrences find themselves surrounding these remains, Quatermass is brought in to study and analyse these phenomena, seeing the profound psychic effect that these artefacts and remains have on people around them. When the concepts and stories of Bernard Quatermass were effectively translated to film in the previous entries, Quatermass in the Pit is a clear, quintessential version of the character put to film. It finds the perfect balance between science fiction, mystery, and abject terror of the unknown, that when combined with the modern technologies and effects that the previous films didn't have, make for a highly memorable experience. Even as the third film in a trilogy, the film works well enough that viewers could just as easily skip the other two entries and not have it affect the viewing experience at all. In 1968, Hammer brings Dennis Wheatley to the screen with The Devil Rides Out, released on July the 20th. With this knife do I draw blood, which is thy life. The Devil Rides Out follows the aristocratic occult Duke Richelieu as he races to rescue his friend Simon Arran from the clutches of a satanic cult. As Richelieu and his allies delve deeper into the dark arts, they confront demonic forces, grim rituals, and supernatural entities bent on ensnaring Arran's soul for eternity. This is one of the more reflective Hammer horrors, with focus on mood over violence. Stylistically, there are many strong elements here, including a finely crafted car chase and a decidedly unsettling circle of protection scene. There are also few bold flourishes, like a shot where a character is punched to the ground and the camera unexpectedly shakes. Plus, The Devil Rides Out is notable for being one of the few Hammer movies where Lee is the hero. It adds up to an intriguing tale of skepticism, evil, and supernatural. And on November 7th, we're back to Dracula, and Dracula has risen from the grave. In the shadow of Castle Dracula, the Prince of Darkness is revived by blood trickling from the head wound of an unconscious priest attempting an exorcism. And once more, fear and terror strikes Transylvania as the undead Prince of Darkness stalks the village of Keinenberg to ensnare victims and satisfy his evil thirst. In 1969, we meet yet another classical monster, and Frankenstein must be destroyed. Baron Frankenstein travels to a new town to meet Dr. Brandt, with whom he has been corresponding and with whom he had hoped to collaborate. He arrives, however, to learn that Brandt is in a mental institution, having lost his mind completely. He takes a room in a boarding house run by a pretty young Anna, who just happens to be engaged to Karl, a doctor who works at the asylum, where Dr. Brandt has been kept. When Frankenstein learns that Karl has been stealing drugs, he blackmails him and Anna to work as his assistants. He is desperate to learn the secret that Brandt was going to share with him and kidnaps him, the intent of extracting that secret by transplanting his brain into another body. And now we arrive at the 70s, a more fitting way to arrive in the 70s than with a salacious title of The Vampire Lovers, released on October the 22nd. A deeply ahead of its time experience regarding themes and depictions of lesbian love and affection, The Vampire Lovers has itched a niche out for itself among the Hammer films' filmography. The movie follows the rise and return of a vicious vampire by the name of Marcella, played by Ingrid Pitt, who under the new name Carmilla is determined to avenge the destruction of her vampire family, as well as satisfy her ever-growing bloodlust. As far as female-centric vampire movies go, few are as effective and influential as Vampire Lovers. While its initial premise seems largely similar to many other vampire and monster films, it's the execution and lesbian themes that help distinguish The Vampire Lovers from other 70s horror films. Carmilla taps into the same style of alluring, hypersexualized enchanting of her victims as other vampire films, although the female-on-female love depicted with her and her victims was some of the first of its kind in film history. It comes together to create a deeply compelling and timeless horror experience that has only served to age gracefully in the 50-plus years since its release. 1971 saw another movie playing on the stereotypical gender roles and twisting them slightly in Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde, released on March 31st, 1972. It's a unique and daring take on the classic Jekyll and Hyde storyline. Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde adds deeply to the philosophical theme of gender and self-image to create brilliant evolution of the story. The film follows a similar sort of structure to other versions of the story, with a pained and disturbed Dr. Jekyll performing dangerous experimentations on himself in a search for immortality. However, instead of a hideous beast, this film's version of Hyde sees Jekyll transform into a beautiful young woman. As this new side fights to become the dominant personality. While Hammer films had adapted the story of Jekyll and Hyde previously, seen in The Ugly Duckling and The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll and Sister Hyde stands out as our best rendition of the material. While during its release, its gender-swapping twist on the concept acted as a novel and fun addition to the classic fable, the film takes on an entirely new meaning in the modern era, aging like fine glass of wine. While it's far from perfect and non-problematic retelling, there's still a core and inherent beauty to a story that fully commits to its theme and concept of gender ambiguity. Blood from the Mummy's Tomb. An archaeological expedition brings back to London the coffin of an Egyptian queen known for her magical powers. Her spirit returns in the form of a young girl, and strange things start to happen. In 1972, we return to Dracula, with Dracula AD 72. In 1972 London, a century after his final battle with Professor Van Helsing, Count Dracula is resurrected by occultist Johnny Alucard. You might notice this Dracula spelled backwards, and goes after his arch-enemy's descendants. 1973, and we're back to another Dracula movie. The Satanic Rites of Dracula, the final Hammer Film studio film to feature both Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing together, and the final film to feature Christopher Lee as Dracula. One of the more interesting of the latter Hammer Draculas, with Dracula disguising himself as a reclusive businessman who is the leader of a satanic cult, also known as Count Dracula and his Vampire Bride. 1974, we're back in the vampire genre post the Dracula era, with Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, released on June the 12th. What he doesn't know about vampirism wouldn't fill a flea's codpiece. This cult classic offers a unique take on the vampire mythos. It centres on fiend-slaying Captain Kronos and his trusty companion Professor Hieronymus Grost as they traverse the countryside in pursuit of vampires. Their quest leads them to a remote village terrorised by a cult plotting to resurrect an ancient vampire queen. Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter is essentially a hybrid of vampire horror and swashbuckling action. While light on frights and gore, the movie boasts notable swordplay sequences, and the mystery surrounding the antagonist adds an intrigue until the final reveal. Most of all, it stands out by experimenting with vampire tropes. Here, different vampire bloodlines have different weaknesses that must be identified in order to destroy them. As Grost explains, there are many species of vampire, as there are beasts of prey. Impressively, both Quentin Tarantino and Peter Jackson have named the film as their favourite. Also, in that year, 1974, to me, one of the funniest vampire movies, although I don't think it was actually meant to be. Tapping into the rise in popularity of martial arts movies in the 70s, the song Kung Fu Fighting by Carl Douglas was released this same year. Hammer decided to marry the vampire and martial arts genre to comical effects. I'm not sure that's what they were going for, though. In China, Professor Van Helsing helps 8 Kung Fu trained siblings to reclaim their ancestral mountain village, now the domain of 7 powerful vampires and their army of undead slaves. 1975 brings us the Ghoul. A former priest named Dr. Lawrence harbours a dark and horrible secret in his attic. The locked room serves as a prison cell for his crazed, cannibalistic adult son, who acquired his savage taste in India during his father's missionary work. There, Lawrence fears that his son will escape and prey upon the effete guests in his rural estate. 1976, the final year that we'll be dealing with in this list, brings us to The Devil a Daughter. An American cult novelist battles to save the soul of a young girl from a group of Satanists, led by an excommunicated priests, who plan on using her as the representative of the devil on earth. To The Devil a Daughter was the last horror made by Hammer, and the penultimate movie made by the old studios. The last being The Lady Vanishes in 1979, before their re-emergence in 2008, since when they have made 9 more movies, which we'll look at in another video. If you would like to be informed of that and any other content, we will be producing, please tap the like, subscribe and notification buttons. We are almost at the magical 1,000 subscribers and be a great help to the channel if you could just take the couple of seconds it takes to do it. Also, we are always happy to hear from you, so please comment. Maybe let us know your favourite hammer and if it has any particular memory for you. Comments, good or bad, all go to making our channel better.